Brilliant, fantastic. So my name is Rachel Withy, and I'm the Head of Research Operations in RSSD, which is our Central Research Division, and I have particular responsibility for working with the College of Social Sciences, which means that City-REDI is an institute that I work with a lot. And it may well be that some of you have done some work with my team already, that some of the contracts, research agreements that you've got in place have been done by members of the team. So I understand that it's data sharing agreements that it would be helpful to spend a bit of time on today. And what I've done, I've got a few slides. I've got an example agreement that we can have a look at. So I'll run through those bits. I'm very, very happy to be kind of interrupted as we go through if you've got any questions. There will also be quite a bit of time at the end for questions. So please, I'm very happy to answer stuff. I should just say, and you'll see on here that there's a bit of a caveat at the bottom. This isn't legal advice for you, for your organisations. This is a kind of opportunity for me to tell you a bit about data sharing agreements, for us to have a conversation about that. But just to be clear, if you feel you need legal advice about them, this isn't it. You need to go and seek this elsewhere. But there's lots of resources and ideas in here that I hope will be helpful. Okay. So with all that caveat bit over, I'll jump forward. So I thought it might be helpful to just start with why we're talking about data sharing agreements. So the type of research, social sciences research that everybody is involved with, it often means that you're frequently going to be working with personal data. The nature of the research that everybody is doing often means that the data that you're coming across is personal identifiable data. And if this research is collaborative, which often it is with all the benefits that collaborative research brings, then you're likely to be sharing data. And that's why it is worth spending some time thinking about data sharing agreements. And the other obviously the other important factor in all of this is the nature of the research that you're doing, the fact it's collaborative, and the legislation. So the data-related legislation, including the UK General Data Protection Regulation. So that's why I think it's just worth spending some time thinking about data sharing agreements. And then before we have a look at an actual agreement, I think it's just quite sensible to take a bit of a step back, and it's worth taking this step back when you're thinking, oh, I need a data sharing agreement, before you start thinking about actually what is this agreement and starting trying to draft stuff or getting someone else to draft stuff for you. It's just worth thinking about the data and thinking about the data flow. So it's worth thinking about exactly what data you're collecting and who you're collecting it from. And you should always be working on the basis that you want to try to collect and share as little personal data as possible. So when you're designing the projects and thinking through the research, it is worth continually thinking about, actually, do I need to collect personal data here? If I am, do I need to share this, or can it be anonymized or pseudonymized before I share it? So really spend a fair amount of time thinking about minimizing A, the amount of personal data that you're collecting, and B, the amount of personal data that you're sharing. So yeah, think about how soon the data can be anonymized. Think about how quickly you can delete any data protection, any personal data that you collect. So the legislation is all around trying to keep people's personal data as safe and as protected as possible. And the simple way of doing that is to collect as little of it as you need, to share as little of it as needs to be shared, and to delete it as soon as you can. So just when you're thinking about the projects, just have all of that in mind, because this will make everything easier as you go along. I've put in here, so firstly, I've put in here, this template is on the ICO, Information Commissioner's Office's website. I really, really recommend that website if you're thinking about data sharing in any way, and personal data management. It's a really, really good website. It's really clear. It's really helpfully set out, and it's got a lot of useful templates. It's got a lot of useful checklists. One of the checklists it has is this data protection impact assessment. Now, if you are using high-risk personal data, sensitive personal data, you need to be, often called special category personal data, you need to be carrying out a DPIA for your work. If it may be that your institution requires you to do it more frequently than that. So at the university, we say that any project where personal data is involved, there needs to be a DPIA put in place. But even if you don't need to do it, either legally or because your institution is saying you need to do it, this is a really good template for just thinking through what is happening with your data in your project. It kind of talks you through the different stages, and just helps you to think through what's going on. So I recommend the ICO website. Just go in and have a look at it. But there are a few things, and I've highlighted a few in this presentation. This is one I really recommend you have a look at. It's really helpful for thinking about personal data in projects. And then, so coming on to actually having a look at a data sharing agreement, and just thinking through a few things before we have a look at one together. You need to be very clear before you start drafting agreement, or when you're reviewing agreement, as to what the roles are. So you've probably heard references to data controllers and data processors. And again, I recommend, and the link is here, so you'll have this on the slides. This, again, on the ICO website, there's a really good kind of checklist and decision matrix to help you decide if you and the partners you're sharing with are data controllers or data processors. The agreements that you come up with will look quite different. If it's a controller to controller agreement where everybody is responsible for the data, for looking after the data, for making any reports back to the ICO that need to be made. And often in collaborative research projects, if you're working together and designing work together, or you've got packages of work split between you, that's the agreement that you're likely to have. I know Beck suggested that we used an agreement that we used for WM-REDI, which we had as part of a long collaboration agreement. And this was the type of agreement that we had in place there, was a controller to controller template that people could then kind of bespoke, basically, put the own data into it, and the names of the organizations into it. And so that's the one I'm going to look at afterwards. So it's worth noting, though, that if you've got a controller to processor arrangement, so that's going to be more, so a transcriber might be a particularly good example of this. If you're asking an organization to do some transcription work for you, they would be a processor. It's not their data, they're not responsible for their data, they've not made any decisions about what data has been collected, they won't be making decisions about how long the data is kept for, what it's being used for, they won't have done the consent forms with the people giving data. And as the controller is still responsible for all of that data. The agreements down to the processor are longer because it sets out a lot of things around how the data should be looked after, around if they get any data subject requests, what should happen with them, around around security of how data is kept. It's more detailed, whereas the controller to controller one is simpler because those legal responsibilities for a controller are clearer around there within the legislation. Sorry, that sounds a bit complex, but you'll see when we have a look at the controller to controller agreement what I mean. And you'll see if you ever see a controller to processor agreement, it's a lot more detailed. It's also worth saying these agreements are sometimes called different things. They're sometimes an annex to a longer agreement. So the one we're going to have a look at is an annex to a longer agreement. They might be called a whole range, it might be information agreement, it might be data security agreement, it might be that it's part of a collaborative agreement, it might be that it's a schedule to a framework agreement. If it's talking about data sharing and it's referencing the legislation and it's talking about controllers and processors and your responsibilities within the UK data protection legislation, then it's a data sharing agreement. It's just that it's got a different name, or it's a schedule to a bigger agreement. So don't worry if it's called something slightly different. Right. In a sec, I'm going to stop sharing from this, and I'm going to hope that I can get this link to work to show you. So this is similar to the WM-REDI agreement that we had in place. It's I've used this one because it's quite been drafted quite recently, it's quite up to date, but also you should all be able to access it. The Brunswick agreements are agreements that are used between universities, and there's a collaboration agreement that's used between universities, but they're accessible online for anyone to have a look at. So if you're just wanting to have a look at a template research collaboration agreement in its entirety, if you follow this link, you can go and have a look at it. And one of the schedules within it is a controller to controller data sharing agreement. So I thought that might be a good one to talk through because it's one that you can then access and you could then potentially use as a template. It's also one, if you're working with universities, it's an agreement or something very similar to it that you're likely to see. So that felt like a good one. Right, what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop sharing this. And bear with me a second. Okay. Can you now see something that says Schedule 6 data transfer and protection?
Yeah, can see that fine, Rachel.
Excellent. Fantastic. Okay. So like I said, you can see at the top in the red text, this has come from this Brunswick agreement, and the link in those slides, you can find this online. You can go and have a look, see how it's laid out. You can see the entire agreement, which is a good collaboration agreement. Actually, it's worth a look. We use it a lot. It has a number of schedules, one of which is this data sharing agreement. And like I mentioned, this is a controller to controller agreement. So this would be used in instances where you were doing some joint research, where you designed the research together, you were doing some collection of the research, or you had some data needed to be shared. The other party is doing the same. You're working on a joint data set. It's those kind of, you've both made the decisions around designing the project and thinking about what the project is going to look like. And this would be the sort of agreement that you'd use in those instances, which I think is a lot of the joint collaborative research that goes on. So the agreement starts with definitions. It will run through controller data protection laws, a description of what personal data is, a description of what a personal data breach is, what we mean by processing, which doesn't mean that someone is a processor. It's about what we mean happening when we talk about data being processed. It then also talks about providers and recipients. And these aren't legal terms, but they're really helpful terms when you're thinking about data flow and the flow of the what information is being shared, where it's coming from and who it's going to. So it talks about providers and recipients, and it talks about what we mean by UK GDPR. And then we've got time, so I'm just going to run you through this in a bit of detail to just explain what this agreement is getting at. So this first clause here, this is saying that the organisation who are providing the data are confirming that they've had people's consent to collect the data and that it is okay for them to share it. So this is an assurance that from the provider of the data that they are happy that they are legally able to share the data. And then in 2.2 here, this has got some obligations for both of the parties. And this is what helps to make this agreement quite short. So we're basically saying that each party is going to comply with their obligations under the data protection laws, because controllers have very clear obligations under those laws, and also comply with obligations in part 2 of this schedule. And we'll go through and have a look at those. It's saying that each party is saying that there is a legal basis for them processing personal data. So when you process personal data, there are various legal bases set out under which you're processing it. As a university, we rely on the basis of public benefit. That is for a lot of collaborative research where it's not involving companies. That is generally the legal basis that we work on, public benefit. So this is saying that both parties in this agreement are making sure that it is legally okay for them to be processing the personal data. This one here is it's getting slightly more complicated than I was going to go into today, but basically is saying that if you've got joint controllers, you need to be very clear on who is responsible for various parts within the data protection laws. So who is responsible for managing requests from data subjects, who is responsible for the consent forms. It sets out various, and you'll see, we've got it in part 3, so you can see it later on, but it basically sets out who is responsible for those particular bits if there's a joint controller arrangement. We tend as a university to try to work on the basis that very little will actually fall under that joint controller setup, partly because this then determining who is doing which bit becomes quite tricky, and it becomes quite tricky to manage on a day-to-day basis. But it's there if you need it, and if people have got any questions about it later on, I'm happy to talk about it a bit more. You then come on and say, so some fairly simple to understand bits here. The data will be used in accordance with this agreement and with all applicable laws. You're not going to do anything with the data outside of what's been put into this agreement. You're going to restrict access to the data to those who need the access. So you're only going to be sharing the data within the project team working on it. It's not going to be shared wider than that. And again, this is all about protecting people's personal data and minimizing how much access there is to it, how long it's kept for, all of those things that we talked about at the beginning. So this is exactly that. The only people who are going to access the data are those who need to. And you will keep the data confidential, and you're not going to disclose it in whole or in part to a third party, building on the clause above. If you get any requests, so the recipient of the data, if they get any requests for the data, we'll send those requests back to the provider. So the recipient of the data is not going to be dealing with those requests. They'll send those back to the provider. You're saying that you will keep the data secure, and that it comes on to a few more security bits later on. And then related to that security part, you're saying that as soon as practical, if you're aware that there's been any unauthorized access to the data, that you'll let the provider of the data know. You're saying that you won't attempt to re-identify any individual from the data or to communicate with any individual re-identified from the data, or to link data sets. So the data that you get, it may be actually clearly somebody's name, and you can obviously see that individual, but you may have data sets from which you could potentially join them together to identify individuals, and you're just making those assurances that you're not going to do that if that's the kind of data that you've got. Basically, what you're saying is you are not going to attempt to get any more identification from the data than you've already got from what's been given. So you're not going to take it and use it to try and contact people or to try and identify in more detail than you've already got from what you've been given. And again, this is all coming back to that protection of personal data within the legislation. And then the last bit is about deleting the data. So there's a clause around saying that you will delete it as soon as you no longer need it. There's wording in here around backups. So all of these is for the recipient of the data, the bits that they will make sure they do to keep the data safe and to keep everything legal. You've got some clauses in here around liability. It's worth saying, as well as the clauses that you've got here, that while we, so speaking for us as a university, while we generally will often try and limit liability within agreements to the value of the agreement, that's a fairly common negotiation strategy by a lot of institutions, and it's definitely what we do as a university. We don't do that around it within the data protection agreement. So we don't limit liability here. And the reason we're not limiting liability is that the fines for data protection are so large for breach of data protection are so large that we don't limit liability. So if you have a collaboration agreement like this, you will probably see that although most of your liability is limited, you will probably find that there's what's called a carve out for breaches of data protection clauses in the agreement, and that is unlimited. And that's why. So if you were to have a data sharing agreement with us, for instance, you would see that, and that's the reasoning behind it. It's due to the size of the fines. Now, you've then got a couple of extra kind of schedule bits. This part one, the description of the data, this is the really key one. So this is about where you're saying this is the data that we're sharing, and you're detailing the data subjects. So is it employees of a particular organization? Is it children at a particular school? Is it staff at a university in a certain department? Who are your data subjects? And if you've got lots of data subjects, you're putting rows for all of them. And the more detail you get into this, the better. And this is where some of that thinking from the beginning around that data protection impact assessment helps. Having done that piece of work makes filling in this an awful lot easier. So you're thinking for the data that you're sharing and that's being shared and being received, who are those data subjects? And then you're thinking of the categories of data. So by this, we mean, are you getting names? Are you getting email addresses? Are you getting ages? Like what's the categories of the data, of the personal data that you're getting? There are, and I won't go into a lot of detail about it today. If you look at the ICO website, as I said, the information's fantastic on there. But there's certain data that's called special category data, where you need to be, there's extra reasons that you need for collecting that, and there's extra compliance and obligations that you need to make sure are in place if you're collecting that special category data. And special category data will be things like race, health information, political views, and you can get the whole list from the ICO website. But if you're collecting any of that, you need to make it very clear in here, acknowledge that you know that that is special category data. And then you're talking about how will the data be used. And it's got in here, someone's put in here in the example for the purposes of the project. I really strongly suggest you put a bit more detail than that. So the more you've got in here, if there was ever a problem and the ICO starts looking at, you know, what's gone wrong, what did they have in place to stop something going wrong? Having a really clear description of the data and how it's going to be used is a really good way of saying, look, we've really tried to get this right. We've thought about the data, we've thought through what's going to be shared, we've tried to minimize it when we can do. We've been really clear about how the data is going to be used. So my strong suggestion for this description of the data part is you really do put as much detail as you can into that. It's really helpful for everyone involved in the project. It's really helpful for people drafting the contract. It's really good practice in terms of managing that personal data. Right, we're coming to the end of this agreement. So there are some provisions here around security measures. So specific things that in this agreement they're saying should always be in place to make sure that the personal data is safe. You're making sure that you will say that you're making sure that it's protected against any malicious software and viruses. Ensuring that the methods for transfer are appropriate. So making sure that you're securing something, that you're keeping the data in a secure way, and that when you're transferring it, that is done in a secure way as well. reasonable steps to ensure the reliability of individuals who have access to the personal data. And this is about minimizing who has access, but it's also about making sure that individuals are properly trained in data protection laws, so that they know what's expected of them when they're working with personal data. So again, at the university, we have compulsory training that everybody working at the university has to do so that they understand their individual responsibilities around personal data and the institutional responsibilities as well. And so this then builds on B is around password protection, encryption, just make sure everything you can to make sure this data is as protected as possible. And then about a secure method for deletion. So make sure that when you delete it, it is actually completely deleted. And this is probably not so relevant for here. We have a clause in here around data protection concerning health, and the NHS Digital Data Security and Protection Toolkit. The NHS, it's obviously very health related, and some of it is potentially not going to be of so much use for all of you. But if you do start reading into this, and it's, it's interesting, you want to find out a bit more, you're aware you might have particular projects in the future which might have a health aspect to them. The NHS Digital Data Security, there's a lot of good resources there. If you search on that term, you'll find some more good resources there to have a look at. The agreement will say that you've got a good system in place if there's any personal data breaches, and that you will notify the provider if the recipient will notify the provider of any breaches as soon as they can. And then this last one is about notifications of any communications from data subjects, and the recipient will notify the provider if any of those communications come to them. And then this last bit, I mentioned this joint controller arrangement. So this last bit is in here. So that if you have got a joint controller arrangement where you are both very closely deciding how the data is used, working on all of the data together in a joint way. So it's quite difficult to describe this. It's if a lot of the development of the project and the running of the project is all together, so let's say not separate work packages, but it's all very it's all managed very closely together by two or more parties, that will end up being a joint controller arrangement. And if you've got that of arrangement, you need to be very clear which of the parties is responsible for these bits down here. So which of the parties are responsible for delivery of privacy notices, handling data subject requests, handling data subject complaints, conducting the impact assessments, leading on breaches, contacting any processors, and liaison with the ICO. In reality, there are not that many setups, certainly that we have, where you need that joint controller bit. But if you do, and that ICO guidance that I pointed you to at the beginning with the difference between processors and controllers has a really good section on joint controllers, so you can work out if you think it is a joint controller arrangement. And if it is, it's fine. You can use this agreement as it is. You will just need to make very clear which parties are responsible for which of these bits. And you will also need to make sure that in the actual management of the project that you are delivering on all of those bits, making sure that each party is carrying through on those responsibilities that they've put in here. So, right, I'm going to stop sharing And I'm sorry, that's taken slightly longer than I thought it was going to. But I'm very happy to take any questions, the time that's left. Hi, Marina.
Hi, Rachel. Thank you very much. That was very interesting. Just have a couple questions. You mentioned in the beginning of your presentation about data anonymization, and that the data sharing agreement kind of covers data sharing until data anonymized. Is it correct?
Sorry, say that again.
You mentioned a data anonymization. I'm not sure if I got it right, but I got it
No,
that,
don't worry.
yeah. So data sharing agreement covers data sharing liabilities before data anonymized, right? Then what happened if, say, data was anonymized or pseudo-anonymized, and that somehow led to some kind of disclosure breaches or whatever? Where should data sharing agreement cover that, and whose liability for that?
So if there is any chance, so you need this agreement in place if it's clearly personal data. You also need it in place if it's pseudonymized data. If anonymized data, you might want an agreement about just sharing data, or it might be that it's covered within the collaboration. But if it's personal data, even if it's been pseudonymized, you need this agreement in place. If one party has got the key for the pseudonymized data, put it in place.
If there is no key and data was either pseudo-anonymized or fully anonymized, would data sharing agreement needed?
If you are confident there is no way that it can be identified, you don't need it.
Okay.
But if you're in any doubt, put it in place, because it's better to have it on the. So we've put ones in place where we've thought actually it's not very likely this isn't really personal data, but there is a slight chance that it could be. If you in anything the way think there is a slight chance that you might be able to identify people from it, put it in place. So you might have something like, if a very small data set, you might have a very small geographic area. You might have a very small geographic area where you're talking about people maybe with particular disabilities. You might just be getting to the point where actually it's such a small number of people it is potentially identifiable, and you will much better to have it in place than not.
Okay. Okay, thank you. And then another question. You mentioned about data deletion after the project closed.
Yeah.
It's not described how data is supposed to be deleted in data sharing agreement. Do I understand correctly that it is somewhere in official guidance where they describe how data should be deleted properly?
So I think it's just spoken about sort of deleted to the point that it's, it can't be, it's not retrievable. So at the university, it's the responsibility. So IT will make sure that it is deleted. It's firstly, there's a backup, and then the backups are deleted. And they make sure that it is completely, after 3 months, I think, after requests for deletion, it's then completely not accessible.
Okay.
It doesn't go into, within the legislation, it doesn't go into detail of exactly what that would look like. It talks about it not being retrievable.
Yeah, because I didn't find that too. All right. Okay. Thank you.
And you could, so you might, we will have some, We will sometimes have some agreements, and government ones are an example, where they are quite specific about how they want the data deleted, and they might ask for certification at the end that says that where we certify that it has been deleted. So some institutions will put some quite detailed, more detailed than that, clauses around security, around how stuff's kept, where stuff's kept. You can build up that as much as you feel is necessary based on the data that you've got. And if you've got very, very secure data, a lot of special category data, you might want in an agreement that you're putting in place to really build on those clauses around how it's kept, and you might want to build in more around how it's deleted. So this isn't that example. It's a template you can use, but you need to use it with thinking about what's this data that I'm working with, and what's the particular project, and do I need to build it up from there? So.
Okay, thank you.
No, we're at 9:30. So.
Does anyone else have any final questions? No, doesn't sound like. Thank you very much, Rachel, for your time today.
Pleasure. So, have good days, everyone.
Thank you.